Good afternoon. My name is Chandra De Silva and I'm the Vice Provost. I have a longer title, but Vice Provost would do. And I'm delighted today to be asked to introduce Kevin Moberly. And Kevin knows that he and I share an interest in computer games, though I'm pretty sure his level of computer gaming is much higher than mine.
You'd be surprised.
Kevin teaches in the Department of English, and he has actually a really challenging title, Playing the Part, Fostering Community, Creativity, and Collaboration Through Play. I think that's a real challenge. But Kevin is quite capable of meeting this challenge because while he teaches in the Department of English, he's worked for years looking at how games, particularly computer games, transcend the distinctions between work and play, between production and consumption. And I'm sure that he's using his great talents to enthuse a number of people, both in the English department and beyond. Before I let him speak, I'd like to put in a plug for the Center for Learning and Teaching. We have had the Provost Conversations sponsored by the Center for Learning and Teaching for quite some time now. And I don't think many of you are aware that these are available if you want to look at past conversations. You got to only, what have you got to do?
clt.edu.edu.
clt.edu.edu. That's where you go. And although you may not find all of these conversations interesting to you, you might be able to pick up a couple of things from some of them. So without further ado, I'll give you Kevin Mobley.
And you can keep talking.
No, because he's going to foster community, creativity, and collaboration through games. I'm looking forward to this.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to my talk. I'd like to, again, also thank CLT, and I'd like to thank Allison Shea, who has tirelessly put up with me. And I really apologize for having put up with me. Something nobody should be subjected to except for my students and the people on the 4th floor who I have offices with. Thank you for coming. Okay, so this is my talk. Playing the part, fostering community, creativity, collaboration through play. I'm a rhetorician. Rhetoric is sort of my corner of the English department. Also, I need 3 volunteers. I need 3 victims. Okay, Robin, since I'm directing your dissertation, sure, which I apologize for. Yes, I'm in your name?
Sarah.
Sarah, so Robin and Sarah and Shauna. Okay, so I have an exercise for you to do while I'm talking, and that way I'd like you guys to, using these Legos, I would like you to build something that represents you. Now, the rules are 15 pieces. No more than 15 pieces, no less than 15 pieces. It has to be 15. You can count, right?
Yes,
15,
yes,
that's 5 fingers.
English, so
right, yeah, because I have problems with that, right?
Exactly.
And so the reason I want to do this is because I want to sort of show you an exercise that I often do on the first day of my classes in freshman composition, English 300, and also I did it in a seminar on medieval and Renaissance literature. So I kind of wanted to sort of have that going on in the background to show what this looks like, because ordinarily I don't lecture very much. I sort of my teaching tends to be much more activity based, much more small group based and things like that. And that gets me off the hook because in anything I say I can say, well, I didn't really say that. But now that we have a camera, so okay. So here we go. I'd like to start off with, and hopefully this will work. That's me. That's my name. I'm a rhetorician. So rhetoric is a very old discipline. We trace our roots back 2,500 years ago in the Western tradition to Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, and the Sophists. I'm concerned with persuasion. And so what I'm interested in teaching is how teaching can persuade students and things like that. So yeah, I guess. And as Chandra said, I'm interested in how games particularly persuade people, how games persuade people to will give up things like love lives and stuff like that with World of Warcraft or dating or all of the other important things, or or why sports are such a central part of our culture, and how do we tap into that as researchers. Okay, so I'm going to start with two inspirational quotations, two very inspirational quotations. The first quotation, Louis Althusser, from his book Marxism, from his essay Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatuses. This is what Louis Althusser says about the school and how the school functions in society. Like I said, it's very inspirational. It takes children from every class at infant school age and then for years drums into them know-how and whatever. Each mass injected en route is practically provided with the ideology which suits the role it has to fulfill in class society. So basically he's saying that the problem with education is that it maintains the status quo. The second quote, which is equally inspirational, is more recent, by Jonathan Kozol, from his book The Night is Long, where he says that education is an ice-cold and superb machine. And at the end he says, the problem with our public schools is not that they do not work, but they do work. I like to bring these quotes because a lot of times sort of the implicit message behind these talks, and all talks about this, is that education needs to be reformed, that education needs to be changed. And so I sort of want to say this is the problem I seek to address, is that our public schools work too well, that they segregate people based on class distinctions, gender distinctions, and things like this. And so this is sort of what I try to confront in my pedagogy and change in my pedagogy. A lot of times, especially when we talk about computer games and things like that, a lot of times people see computer games and games as a sort of panacea, technological solution to bad teachers unions, and things like that. But really, I think that the problem with education is the system of education. And then again, as you can tell, I'm probably a little bit of a Marxist, and I apologize for that. Right, okay, so now that we've gotten the inspiration out of the way, we'll go to the disclaimer. Right, how are we doing here? You guys are fast. You're not using pieces that were already, never mind now. I'm sorry. You're not cheating. Okay, so disclaimer. I see teaching as research. And this is what happens, I think. We observe what takes place in our classroom. And from that observation, we form hypotheses about how to make our pedagogies more rhetorically effective. And then we go into our classrooms and we revise and we test these hypotheses. So in other words, what I'm saying is your mileage may vary. This is sort of the techniques that I use in your class. This excuse works really well if your department chair gets complaints about you, and you get called into her office or his office, and you can say, well, it was just a research project gone awry, and then you can say, oops, right? And it works really well, right? But so teaching is research, and teaching is experimentation. And that's sort of what I want to sort of do. I almost want to go to say that teaching is a form of play, but maybe I'm pushing a metaphor too far. Okay, so as a rhetorician, I'm a social constructivist rhetorician. How many of you know what that is? I'm sure you do. But I wanted to give an overview of my sort of basic tenets of how I think education happens, how I think learning happens, and that sort of thing. And we'll get to play. We're getting there eventually. Right. Oh, you're done. Excellent. Okay, so social constructivists believe that knowledge is not a thing, it's not a commodity. We believe in what we call a process-based approach to education versus a product-based. Paulo Freire talks about what he calls the banking model of education, which is sort of what I'm subjecting you to, in which we educators construct the audience as empty vessels in which I pour my knowledge to, and you're supposed to fill up to the brim and then overflow and repeat my knowledge back to you. And again, this is sort of what social constructivist pedagogy resists. Social constructivist pedagogy says that knowledge is a social construction, that the only way we know things is because we talk about things, because we have conversations with each other. And a really good example of this is, how many of you have seen a movie lately? If any of you guys are allowed to go to movie theaters, you let David go to movie theaters. You had a date at a movie theater. Right, well, that's okay. That's more dates than I've had in 7 years because I play computer games. Right, and you go and you see a movie. What movie did you see recently? Lincoln. You saw Lincoln. I'm sorry. And the first thing you do when you walk out of that movie theater is you look at the other person and you ask what? What did you think? Right, what did you think? And what you're doing there is you're creating the reality of the film in consensus with each other. You're sort of norming. And, you know, David probably said, well, there needed to be more zombies or vampires or something, right? Or I didn't like Daniel Day-Lewis, or I thought he was, you know, hot. I don't know. So that's what social constructivism says. That's how knowledge is created, that people come together and then they talk about what they've experienced and how to make sense of what they've experienced. We're not also talking about knowledge, but we're also ultimately also talking about reality, that you're creating the reality of the film after the fact from that. So knowledge, we say, is produced, maintained, and policed through discourse communities. And policed is a pretty strong word, but it's sort of what happens in our classrooms a lot of times, in which we have ways of performing, ways of acting that we valorize and that we enforce. Right, so knowledge to social constructivist is a performance. Knowledge is all about performance. It's not a thing, it's something we do. It's something that we produce. All of you are sort of producing knowledge about this talk, and afterwards, when you write letters of complaint to the provost, you will say, right, this is what happened, and this is sort of the version. So, right, social constructivism. So, to social constructivists, this is how social constructivists understand our role and our sort of challenges as teachers, is to help students transition from familiar discourses and familiar forms of performances. A lot of times, I don't know how many of you have been to the forums on the Chronicle of Higher Education site? Do you have? Yeah, they're wonderful inspirational sites because you get things that are posted over and over that my students can't think, you know. My students can't write. My students can't whatever, and the sort of things like that. Well, if you think about this, if your students really, if students, not your students, because I don't know if any of you have posted, if students really couldn't think, well, they probably would have a hard time doing a lot of things. What social constructivists say, that students can think, by the time students get into our classrooms, they are expert thinkers already. They're expert at negotiating discourses which they're familiar with. Some of those discourses are, unfortunately, consumerism, popular culture, and things like that. What our students are not good at is doing to the performances that our discourse is privileged. And these are very specific discourses that seem natural and intuitive to us because we've been in these discourse communities for years and years and years. Writing is sort of is another fine example. a lot of times when our students come to our classrooms, they are very good at writing things like text messages. And I would say even better at writing text messages than we are. Or at least they're very good at writing emails that do the job of communicating information to their friends. But then when they write an email to a professor, well, you've seen what they look like, right? Because they don't know the discourse. And so as social constructivists, we try to say, okay, we need to help students make the transition from discourses and performances with which they are already know and familiar with to unfamiliar discourses. And then there's a larger thing, because all of these sort of discourses intersect and overlap, sort of like the pictures in the background of my PowerPoint. There's, right, to the sort of performances that the university privileges and no pressure on us as educators, to the larger social, cultural, economic, and political forms of performance that what we constitute, say, is good citizenship, or in my case, bad citizenship, or something like that. So social constructivist pedagogy tries to make students aware of how the learning communities that they're involved in ask them to perform as subjects, how they're asked to construct themselves as subjects, instead of saying, okay, well, you know, repeat to me verbatim when the Battle of Waterloo was, which I don't really remember when that was. Chandra, I'm sure knows. Okay, so again, this is a nutshell, and I guess I should say this is a theorem that I kind of work with in my own teaching, is that what we teach is not the substance of our disciplines. I don't teach good grammar. I don't teach in my rhetoric classes when Plato was born or what Plato said or something like that, but the performances through which this substance is produced. So I teach my students how to read Plato in order to understand on their own terms what he said, to understand reading as a form of performance, what academics valorize as reading, how to get the message, how to read between the gaps, and things like that. Substance, I say, is always a performance. Okay. We'll return to that point somewhere. Okay, so and what you've all been waiting for is, so what does play have to do with all of this? Why play? Why not, I don't know, violence or anything like that? Well, good. One thing social constructivists understand, that learning is a fundamentally traumatic thing that happens to all of us. My cat can attest to this. I'm trying to teach him to not eat as much. So when we ask students, we not only ask students to transition from familiar to unfamiliar discourses, but from versions of reality in which they are heavily invested and have considerable expertise, have sometimes a status in. And if you think about this in terms of high school, we're asking high school seniors to come to the university as college freshmen. We're asking them to move away from their parents and to live in dorms. We're asking them to sometimes to go from a very small town in Virginia to a very large campus, to encounter different populations, different voices, different ways of looking at the world, all of which are exposing them to a version of reality that is sometimes very different and very threatening. Realities that they only can know as amateurs. So if students succeed, what does this mean? It means that they have to leave behind everything that they're familiar with, or at least to threaten to leave behind everything that they're familiar with, in order to take up something that hasn't been proven or justified. All of us have kind of been through this, and so we kind of I don't know. I always think about me when I went to school. Anyways, if students fail, then the threat is that they might leave behind everything that they're experts at and not have anything else that they're experts at, to be left alone. And so if you think in terms of social constructivism, that humans are social animals, the threat of not having a society is a pretty big threat. So students resist learning. Students resist our pedagogies. Students a lot of times, especially in the contemporary university, the neoliberal university, which is a university that sometimes privileges the experience of being at school over the content, the substance, or the performance of being a student. Rather, and if you want evidence of this, you just have to look at any movies produced recently about colleges, in which the tagline of one was, all of the fun of college and none of the learning, I think was one of the recent ones. So students will default into what might be called the safe or familiar form of discourse. So why play? And this is sort of my main thing. My main point is that, and this is from Brian Sutton Smith, that play is ambiguous. It's fundamentally ambiguous. And he says, and he's summarizing research in the field, and this is the beginning of his book, that animals at play bite each other playfully, knowing that a playful nip connotes a bite, but not what a bite connotes. A playful nip is not only not a bite, it is also not a bite. See what's happening here, right? That is, it is a positive, the sum of two negative, which is again to say that the playful nip may not be a bite, but it is indeed what a bite means. So play allows students to, and this is my hypothesis, to be in two places at one time, to remain in this familiar discourse community, but to role play, to experiment being in another discourse community. Play allows students to say, well, I mean, I was only playing, right? This wasn't serious. Play is, so play is, it's an action that's not an action, so to speak, which is what allows students a way of saying, okay, well, maybe I can try out this role. In the same way that you have when people play computer games. Maybe I can play a Night Elf Druid and see if I like it. You know, and if I can always go back to the character creation screen and try something again. So, and this is something in a lot of special social constructive literature, you have a lot of talk about the trauma of learning and things like that. And so this is where I sort of see my pedagogy fitting into this, or that, right? Some other reasons is that play is popular. The biggest buildings on this campus are dedicated to what? Sports. And sports is what happens with sports? People play games, right? Play is popular. Play is pervasive. As Ken McAllister points out in his book, Game Work, which is on computer games, that play saturates our everyday discourse. When you play something, what do you play? You play an instrument? Right. You play instruments? Okay, what else? How else is play used?
Play the stock market.
You play the stock market? Okay.
Radio.
You play the radio? How else? You play somebody for a fool? Right? You play games. You play, huh?
iPad.
What?
iPad.
iPad, right. You play with your iPad. iPhone. We put on plays, you know, and I can go on and on and on and on about play. So play is a word we use in our discourse all the time. It's something that, well, it's something we want to do. Play, more seriously, functions as a contact zone. It allows spaces in which otherwise disparate ideas, entities, and populations can intersect and interact. I mean, think Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, as a form of play, where you can, who would have thought Abraham Lincoln and vampires are together, or Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which is also one of my other sort of favorite sort of things. And so play allows for things that you ordinarily would not think of putting together to be put together. And it creates a space where if things don't quite work out, then, oh, well, we were just playing. You know, I don't think it's an accident that that sports in the United States were some of the first integrated activities that we had as a society. Because, but play also functions as a metaphor for a lot of things, like politics. We just had an election, I think. And if you paid attention to the way that people were talking about the election, they were using the same language that sportscasters were using. And it's very similar to the way people describe football. And if you think about our two-party system, in which you have Democrats and the Republicans in opposing colors on a field, and they all block and things like that. So play is a metaphor for, in our society, for American political system. Play is a discourse which our students are already very familiar with and very good at by the time they get here. And you see where I'm going here with this. Okay, so play privileges performance over substance. And this comes from computer game studies, where there's a debate, which is the narratology versus ludology debate. And the ludologists basically say that computer games don't have to tell stories to be good. Now that is hearsay to the English department, to people in the English department, right? That computer games do not have to use the narrative word in order to be good. And in fact, they say that if computer games do use the narrative word, it's only as a means to an end. That what is, Espen Arseth famously said that if somebody throws you a ball, you don't expect the ball to tell you a story. And there's some problems with that debate, but if you think about what happens in games, narratives are often appended after games, but that what happens in games is that with checkers or chess or something like that, is that what people pay attention to is the performance of the game rather than the substance that's going on. And the substance of play is always the performance. So that's that kind of thing. Okay, so Richard Rorty has an interesting schema about how knowledge is produced. Richard Rorty says that knowledge is produced through two discourses. Normal discourse, he says, is discourse that perpetuates the status quo or the norms. Things like that. And so this is play can do that, and that play foregrounds rules. Speaking of rules, how are you doing? You're all done, right? You're great. So I'm getting to you soon. So yeah, you don't want to revise these creations, or
I've revised it several times.
yeah, you have 3 heads on your dude.
Yes, I do.
That's excellent. Right. So play foregrounds rules. Play recognizes failure. It's something that we're very, Chandra and I were just sort of talking about this before our talk with any of you who play computer games know that you're not going to solve the puzzle the first time or the second time. And if you do solve the puzzle the first time or the second time, you're disappointed because you think the game is somehow too easy, you know. One of my sort of hypotheses is about our sports culture is it's a way of helping people come to terms with when their political party loses. Because after all, if you're a sports fan or you follow sports, like my friend Dr. David Rowe, who's a big fan of UCLA, who got their butts stomped on by Stanford last Friday night. Right, yes. You know, you're accustomed to your team losing, and you have that I'm playing with you. But there's a rematch this Friday night, apparently, right? So you're accustomed to your team losing, and you expect your team to lose, and so that sort of, I think, normalizes or maybe makes us a little more accepting of when our political party doesn't win, and maybe prevents things like revolution and civil war and all the other fun things we could do in our spare time, right, when we're discontent. So play encourages rehearsal. This is from theater, dramaturgy. Play necessitates self-reflection, especially in games are like, okay, well, that didn't go very well. I lost. Well, what's a more efficient way to do this? What's a better way to do this? Play necessitates critique. Oftentimes, we're critiquing ourselves, or we're critiquing other people, or critiquing what happened. And play is serious, even when it isn't. Play is, as we say in gamer speak, serious business. Play is serious business. We take play very, very seriously. So much so that the people with the highest salaries oftentimes are people who play, actors, sports figures, things like that. So Richard Rorty says that if normal discourse perpetuates the status quo of the conversation, the knowledge of the community values, abnormal discourse is how knowledge is created. Abnormal discourse happens when people challenge normal discourse. When somebody says, well, what would happen if we did this? Or I don't agree with that. Or something like that. So this is, play encourages abnormal discourse. Play encourages experimentation. Oftentimes, when we're faced with rules, what do? We try to game them, to break them. And again, sports is a great metaphor of that. There's apparently some soccer technique where you could act like you're injured in an attempt to get the ball or something, and that has shifted to basketball now, where it's like you act like you're injured. And so that's experimentation. Play implies cheating. So cheating through a social constructivist is a way that new knowledge is created. It might not be the knowledge that we want to be created, but it's knowledge that is being created. Play is destructive. One meaning of the word play is something you do not want to have in your automobile engine is a play of the pistons and the cylinders, because then your engine might shake itself apart. Play implies possibility. So when we play with things, we're constantly sort of thinking about what else is possible. And then finally, play breaks things. And play is frivolous even when it's serious. Okay, so that's the sort of why play. These are some, what I call in gamer speak, various strategeries. And for how can you do this in your classroom? What are some basic outlines? So rather than conceiving of tasks that are designed to accomplish learning objectives, instead of thinking about the products that you want your students to produce, think in terms of games that imply specific forms of performance. Okay, so for example, reading is a performance. So how can you have students, how can you construct a game that foregrounds how students read? Well, simple things, scavenger hunts, ask them to find things, interesting things in a text. One of my favorite examples is when I was teaching early American literature, and Drew Lupizino has the privilege of teaching early American literature, and there's this wonderful work called On Plymouth Plantation, which just goes on and on and on. But there's a guy named Thomas Granger that's featured in On Plymouth Plantation, and so you ask students to figure out what happened to Thomas Granger. And I'm not going to tell you, because hopefully this will all make you go read On Plymouth Plantation. It goes on and on and on. So think in terms of what you want students to know how to do, rather than what you want them to know. Because sort of my theory as a social constructivist is that if you teach people how to do something, then the know part will follow after that, the performance over the substance. So start small, and this is where we get to this exercise. Construct simple games based on modes of play with which students are already familiar. Role-playing, is one that works really well. When I teach Plato's Phaedrus, which, as you haven't read, is a very sort of dense text that goes on and on, for the 5th century BCE. Why are we teaching the Phaedrus? Because I'm a historical rhetorician.
To go on and on.
Right, right. Exactly. And this is how our students see them. And so you, as a instructor, you sort of say, well, how do you make students invested in this text, in these texts? One way is to, what I do with the Phaedrus is I have students make sock puppets and perform the scenes. And this is a classic social constructivist technique for dramas and things like that, is you actually have people role play and put on the play. And of course, Socrates was Plato's sock puppet anyway. So begin with ludic, goal-oriented games. And ludic comes from Roger Calais. He was a French theorist of play who talked about play as a continuum between ludus and paetus. Ludic is goal-oriented games where you begin students with simple sort of tasks. You know, I want you to, well, here's a simple task that I asked you to begin with. What did I ask you guys to do?
Construct something that was representative of
Right.
who we were with using the Legos.
Okay, right. So, and what did you construct? And I'll
Well, I constructed a little mobile house because I feel like I'm constantly on the go.
see this.
And I gave myself multiple heads because I feel like I've got multiple identities, you know, as a teacher, student, you know, just as somebody
Okay.
normal.
I don't know if you can.
Not that
See
that's
that?
really not normal, but, you know, and it's my
Right.
little house and a tree, and I like
Okay.
nature, so, yeah, there it is.
Okay, mobile house. Right,
Yeah.
good. And Sarah, I'm sorry. You constructed, wait, but don't, where did you, did this? This is important, I think. You had it up here, I guess. So Sarah, what did you make?
That's me, and I spend a lot of my time observing others in my job and in fun. So I put a window in there because I'm always liking to look in. I also have a tree because I love the holiday season and I love being outside. I'm holding a little jewel because I enjoy arts and crafts and kind of doing little crafty things. And I've got a cool Segway because I've always wanted one. And I've got a backpack on. I love hiking. And I've got a stormtrooper helmet on because I'm a sci-fi geek.
Okay, excellent, excellent, excellent. And I've forgotten your name. That was insensitive of me.
That's okay. I'm Shauna,
Shauna,
like iguana.
like
And
iguana.
I have an 8 and a 6-year-old, so we're heavily into Legos and stormtroopers right now. So I was drawn to that. I also feel like I have to go a million miles an hour, like on some spaceship. But that's sort of it turned out that this is my family. I didn't realize it was going to be my family, with my 2 kids on the wings and my husband going the opposite direction. With me on the front and my mother sort of behind me, and my desperate desire for a picket fence lifestyle that never really comes to fruition. So a nice therapy session. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not really an expert in marriage or anything like that, but the research suggests that this is normal.
Okay.
Okay, so this is an exercise that I oftentimes use on the first day of my classes, and I have this whole big box of Legos in my classes. Why do I do this exercise? Self-reflection, right, self-reflection. And you saw Robin and Sarah and Shauna, like iguana, self-reflecting about stuff like this, right? So self-reflection, students are forced to sort of do that. Okay, why else? It relaxes the students, right? It relaxes the students. Just the fact that we have Legos on the table seems somehow less intimidating and less comforting. Okay, why else?
Symbolic thinking.
Okay, you're like 20 years ahead of me. Yes, symbolic thinking. Yes, definitely. Yes, that was where we're supposed to get to the end. But thank you. I can see why you two are married, because he always did that in my classes too. Right. So yeah, symbolic thinking. So I'm asking them to. What is symbolic thinking?
Well, I guess I was just saying that the students here were finding items that represented different aspects of their life. So they're creating symbols to represent their identity.
Okay, right. Creating symbols to represent their identity. Great, and I'm going to return to that because there's another reason that's related to that, but I don't want to. Notice how I'm not, these are the questions I ask my students. I'm trying not to tell the students what the answers are. Why else would I have my students do that? It creates community, right? You guys have to negotiate about who gets the stormtrooper versus who gets that, and it gets much more intense when you get a group of 20 to 30 students, and the Legos and computer games are great about this, about creating artificial scarcity and having people fight over them, which I don't think is a good thing. But anyways, okay, why else? Okay, you have something, as Liz Black said, that can stand in for a student, right?
So it can say things that the student might be scared about saying themselves. If
Okay.
the avatar says it, then it's not a big deal.
Right. So Liz said that we'll repeat that because it was brilliant.
Okay. You get an object that can stand in for a student. And often an avatar can say something that a student would not be comfortable
Right.
expressing in their own voice.
Okay. Yeah. Why else?
Demonstrate, show students, how do they, be creative and be cooperative, and show that their kind of, performance.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What else? What does it say? Yes.
It encourages them to engage in analysis. I mean, they're breaking
Okay.
themselves down into smaller
Uh-huh.
parts, which is a basic part
Right.
of any of our
Right.
classes.
Sort of like the symbolic thing. Yes. Exactly. What else? What does it say about me as a teacher? Exactly. Exactly, right? So there's that. But then I sort of asked the student to say, okay, and we're already there, we're already gotten there with symbolic action, but I asked a student to say, okay, this is a writing class. So I said, what if I said that this was a form of writing? What if I said that this was a form of writing and that these things, so how did the Lego sets limit what you could create?
They were very sci-fi focused.
Okay, they were very, so we have another, more creations that have popped up here in the margins, right? They're very sci-fi focused. These Legos are very sci-fi focused. Might we say they're masculine?
Incredibly.
Right, and incredibly, or as Derrida would say, Suzu would say, phallo-logocentric. Right, this is a very phallo-logocentric Lego set, which is a way of, Suzu is French, I think. Which is a way of saying, okay, how, and then you could say, and we're running short on time, you could say, ask them to say, okay, how did the language you use construct you, when you're putting together language? And then you can say, okay, well, what pieces did you want to be here? And things like that. So you could get a whole discussion on the first day of freshman composition about how language works and fitting together and what's the relationship. And all of you always have the big blocks at the bottom and the small blocks at the top. And there's a sort of logic and things like that. And you can lead students through that through questions. And I'm sort of giving you the thing, and this is sort of, again, symbolic sort of thing is, and what does it mean when we are forced to create our realities with only 15 pieces and within a certain time period, and what do you come up with, and things like that. And then what I do is I say, okay, I want you to go home and I want you to find magazines and newspapers, and I want you to cut out 15 words that represent you and bring them into class. These 15 words that you cut out, that you find from magazines or newspapers, and I don't say library books, so don't worry, right? And bring these in. And then you can have students trade words and things like that, and then to say what's missing from these words. And so you get to this notion of, okay, putting things together, constructing things through language. I don't know how that would work in French. Okay, so really, which is about my vocabulary of French that I have too. Yeah, je ne parle pas le français. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, I'm sorry, but you start with simple things and then you move to complex. Start with simple forms of play, move to complex. Start with ludic, goal-orientated tasks to open-ended task, chaotic play. Play, which is what Calais says is play in which sort of what you do when you have a ludic play is when you start with a Lego set with instructions. Chaotic play is when you have a big box of Legos and anything goes, right? And so you start with that, and so you start with, finish with large-scale collaborative projects. One project that works really well is to ask students to create a game that teaches something that your course is teaching, and to work together with each other in order to create this game. And that means writing the manuals, making the pieces, and all that kind of stuff. Move from frivolous to serious, move from informal to formal, move from low stakes to high stakes. And this is pretty important. At the beginning, you want games that everybody can succeed at. You want tasks that everybody can succeed at in terms of grading and things like that. But as you move on and things, you want to encourage people to return and to replay and to revise and to reflect. And it's very hard to get students to return, revise, and reflect if they're just going to get credit for doing something. So move from low stakes to high stakes. This is a sort of scaffolding sort of thing. Move from self to community. This sort of is an exercise about self. Students are very comfortable with self, and in our society we tend to be very expressivist, sort of romantic, individualistic society. Students hate working with each other. They hate working with each other with a passion. And so you have to sort of convince them that it's all right to work with each other. And eventually you want to make students move from thinking themselves as players to conspirators to co-creators. You want to think of them as helping you teach the class at the end, being involved in it, and rather than just absorbing the material, sort of things. So again, let students practice, reflect, and play. And this is important. With games, scoring, and things like that, games are very statistically things, or at least computer games. And students, especially our students in contemporary college, they always want to know where they stand. They always want to know where they stand. At the beginning, this is very important. At the end, I tend to say, okay, well, where do you think you stand? You know, because eventually you want the students to become self-actualized. You want them to evaluate themselves rather than to concentrate on you evaluating them or something. So establish structures through which students can measure their progress, and also make students responsible for each other's success, especially as you move on and you get more complex. When you're doing group work, you know, if one person isn't, and this is something oftentimes we'll get from a student, which will say, well, student X in my group isn't doing anything. And so how do you answer that complaint? I always say, well, how can you deal with that? How can you inspire student X? What would you do? Can you think of a small task that you can give this student that they can complete? You know, let students challenge the rules. Let students break the rules, and let students suggest new rules, especially as you get more, because that to challenge rules and break rules suggests that they've mastered the rules, or at least have some idea of how the rules work. Okay, so that's basically my talk. I have a conclusion side, somewhat in conclusion. I wanted to say, I guess my goal in all of this is I want to create a sort of a pedagogy that inverts and displaces traditional learning. or what we call traditional learning, that helps students focus on the way things fit together, the sort of gaps between the Lego pieces, the performance of putting these things together, to let them see what's not there, that we sort of assume is always there, so that they sort of understand themselves to be performers with a part to play in the sort of what goes on in the classroom and the university. Sometimes it works, and well, thank you for coming.